This isn't just a story about a man who got lost. This is the catastrophic collapse of a hero's universe, a journey so brutally cursed, so unbelievably cruel, that it shattered the very definition of heroism. Can you believe one man, lauded as the cleverest mind in the entire ancient world, could spend 10 years fighting a brutal war, only to spend another 10 agonizing years fighting just to get back to his own front door? This is the epic saga of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, and the very gods themselves conspiring to erase him from the face of the earth. A catastrophe no one saw coming, a divine retribution so cold and precise it turned his homecoming into a living nightmare of unimaginable, heartbreaking proportions. We begin not with his birth, but with his moment of greatest glory, which instantly transforms into his greatest fall. Troy is burning. Smoke chokes the skies, a monument to the ultimate strategic deception, the Trojan horse, the ultimate stroke of genius conjured by the unrivaled mind of Odysseus himself. He stood on the ramparts, watching a decade of bloodshed finally culminate in victory. The Greeks were delirious, drunk on the scent of triumph, believing they had defeated the impossible city through sheer human force. But in that moment of collective euphoria, a deadly sin was committed, a fatal flaw that drew the immediate attention of forces far older and far angrier than any human army: hubris. The Greeks forgot who allowed them the victory. They forgot to pay the appropriate tribute. They acted as if they were the masters of destiny, deserving of the effortless return home. And Odysseus, the man whose cunning won the war, was about to pay the highest price for that immense collective arrogance. He dared to think he could control fate, and the Olympians laughed. Imagine the scene. The ships are loaded, sails ready to catch the wind, and Odysseus feels the immense weight lifting from his shoulders. He has his remaining men, his immense loot, and the promise of Penelope waiting, steadfast and true. He just needs a smooth sail across the Aegean. A simple, short trip. What could possibly go wrong now that the war is won? Everything. The answer, brutally, terrifyingly, is absolutely everything. Because when the gods of Olympus decide you are their personal target, the ocean itself becomes a sentient, boiling weapon, and every island becomes a death trap disguised as paradise, beckoning you closer to destruction. It was the wise goddess Athena who loved him, but it was Poseidon, the earth-shaker, the master of the deep, who marked him for ruin. And why? Because of that final, unforgivable arrogance displayed by the Greeks in Troy, and because of the brutal, unnecessary desecration of sacred ground. A massive, sudden storm erupted, summoned by Athena herself seeking retribution, but instantly amplified 1,000-fold by the simmering rage of Poseidon, whose underwater domain had been disrespected for 10 long years. This was not a typical squall. This was the entire ocean boiling with divine hatred, ripping the fleet apart like paper dolls tossed into a hurricane. Odysseus's fleet, already diminished by a decade of war, was scattered instantly. The initial journey home, meant to take weeks, was instantly transformed into a terrifying, isolated struggle for survival against the unleashed elements. They hadn't even reached the open sea before the first taste of the curse hit them with bone-shattering, soul-crushing force. His men, exhausted by war, now faced an enemy they could not fight, could not reason with, and could not defeat, the boundless, depthless fury of the sea god. This was the moment the hero died, and the wanderer was born. He didn't know it yet, but Ithaca was not a destination. It was a cruel, mocking mirage on the horizon of his nightmares. The first land they stumbled upon was the coast of the Cicones, specifically the town of Ismarus. They were tired, hungry, and desperate for supplies after the chaos of the storm. They landed, and forgetting every military lesson learned over the last decade, they acted like mindless, greedy pirates, driven by base exhaustion and the promise of quick plunder. But the men, blinded by their sudden, easy plunder, refused. They drank, they feasted, they slept heavily on the beach, their guard completely down, their military training forgotten. Can you imagine the sheer, maddening frustration of the cleverest man alive, watching his entire crew succumb to foolish, drunken carelessness, jeopardizing everything? And then, just as predicted, the Cicones retaliated. They gathered their neighbors, professional fighters trained in swift, devastating cavalry charges, and launched a massive dawn attack on the unprepared Greeks. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter of the drunken and the sleeping. Odysseus and his remaining loyal fighters fought desperately, trying to drag their reeling comrades back to the safety of the ships, sacrificing 6 men from every single ship just to buy enough time to escape the vengeful, relentless spears. They fled Ismarus, heartbroken, lighter by 72 men, and carrying the bitter, toxic knowledge that their own indiscipline had caused the first major disaster of the journey home. They escaped the Cicones, but they sailed directly into the gaping maw of the fates and the relentless, unforgiving ocean, driven by a furious, vengeful gale. The wrath of the gods was just starting to simmer, barely visible beneath the waves. The taste of victory was gone, replaced by the salty sting of grief and the dawning, terrifying realization that the war was never truly over. It had simply moved from the blood-soaked plains of Troy to the infinitely more dangerous, terrifying arena of mythological survival at sea. Odysseus had survived the siege, the duels, and the betrayal of men, but now he faced the terrifying power of mythological creatures and the eternal, unpredictable malice of the divine. This was the opening move in a game of survival that would span 20 years and redefine what it means to lose absolutely everything, one agonizing day at a time. Get ready, because the Odyssey is not a simple adventure. It is a masterclass in pain, tragedy, and the agonizing, slow destruction and reformation of a legend. The dust of Troy had barely settled, the ashes still warm and smoldering, when the celebratory shouts of the Achaean army turned into the gasps of the damned. They thought the war was over. They were wrong. The true war, the war against the heavens, had just begun. Their victory was not a triumph, but a poisoned chalice laced with the bitter venom of unchecked hubris. The gods watched from Olympus, not cheering their mortal pawns, but seething with righteous, cold fury. The disrespect was a physical thing, a black stain rising from the plains of Troy. The crime that sealed their fate? Ajax the Lesser, driven by animalistic lust and the delirium of triumph, dragged the prophetess Cassandra from the very altar of Athena. This was the ultimate sacrilege, a direct, unforgivable offense against the warrior goddess who had just handed them the victory. Athena, the tactical mastermind, the patron of Odysseus, felt a rage so profound it shook the foundations of the world. She decided that if the Greeks had no respect for the divine laws, then the divine laws would execute them with surgical precision. And to accomplish this mass execution, she called in the biggest gun of all. She formed an unholy, temporary alliance with the Earthshaker himself, Poseidon. Poseidon already had a personal burning vendetta brewing against Odysseus, a detail the hero would soon understand with crippling clarity. But now he saw a chance for wholesale carnage, a true tidal cleansing of the Aegean Sea to punish all the arrogant mortals. The signal for the fleet to sail was instantly transformed into the signal for slaughter. They launched their 1,000 ships into a nightmare of wind and wave. They believed the sea was their highway home. Poseidon showed them it was their watery grave. The armada, so powerful and unified just hours before, shattered instantly, driven apart by squalls that materialized out of thin, clear air. Men who had survived 10 years of brutal, bloody combat were now swallowed whole by waves taller than the walls of Troy. They drowned clutching useless bronze shields, their final breath stolen by the chaotic fury of a sea god who demanded utter, groveling respect and received none. This was the first, terrifying lesson. You do not defeat mortals only to immediately disrespect the divine. While the main body of the fleet, under the doomed Agamemnon and the resourceful Menelaus, was driven south toward the impossible hazards of Crete and Egypt, Odysseus and his loyal, battle-hardened corps of 12 ships made a desperate tactical decision. They broke away, attempting a rapid northern thrust across the upper Aegean, thinking speed would defeat the gods' coordinated storms. This separation, this moment of strategic genius gone wrong, was the exact point where Odysseus sealed his unique, agonizing fate. He managed to evade the immediate, crushing storm that wiped out thousands of nameless Achaeans, yes, but he sailed directly into the curated, personalized hell designed specifically for him by the vengeful deities. His crew, all 12 ships filled with Ithacans, men who had marched with him, fought with him, bled with him, looked at the receding shores of Asia Minor, relieved to be alive. They had no idea that those shores were the last piece of recognizable, safe land they would see for 2 decades, or that most of them were already marching toward their doom, one horrifying landfall after another. Their first stop, the first port of call where they could finally stretch their legs and refill their supplies after escaping the immediate divine pursuit, was the land of the Cicons, specifically the wealthy city of Ismarus. They arrived like the victors they were, sweeping down on the innocent city, looting the treasuries, and capturing women for slaves. It was a successful textbook raid, a quick injection of wealth and morale that should have been their saving grace. Odysseus, the disciplined tactician, immediately ordered his men back to the ships. They had achieved their goal. The mission was complete. But 10 years of war had eroded their discipline, replacing obedience with arrogance. They were greedy, swollen with the spoils of Troy, and drunk on the local wine they discovered in vast cellars. They refused to leave. They spent the night feasting, ignoring the frantic warnings of their captain about the danger of lingering. And that night, the Cicones gathered their hardened allies from the interior, riding down on the feasting Achaeans at dawn like a terrifying tidal wave of cold vengeance. This was not a glorious battle against heroes. This was a sickening massacre of drunken, sluggish soldiers caught entirely off guard by disciplined cavalry. The men fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by warriors fighting to protect their homes. Odysseus, roaring orders and swinging his deadly spear, managed to rally his remaining forces. He secured the retreat, but the cost was devastating, immediate, and utterly heartbreaking. He sacrificed 6 men from each of his 12 ships, a brutal, agonizing loss of 72 battle-hardened Ithacans, just to get the remaining few back onto the waves. 72 fresh ghosts haunted the remaining 11 ships as they fled Ismarus, the wind now screaming, not howling, at their sterns. This time, the storm was different. It was personalized. It was engineered. Zeus himself, appeasing the newly unified wrath of Athena and Poseidon, unleashed a crushing northern gale that tore the thick linen sails to shreds and snapped the massive oak masts like brittle twigs in a child's hand. For 9 terrifying days and 9 even more agonizing nights, they were lost, helpless playthings of the elements, unable to navigate, unable to steer, utterly dependent on the whims of the punishing winds. When the storm finally subsided, they were no longer in the familiar, navigable waters of the Aegean. They had been driven far south, past the Peloponnese, past Crete, into a region of the world that existed only in sailors' myths and nightmares. The known world had vanished behind them. They were adrift in the deep, uncharted blue, heading toward the truly surreal, the impossible, and the monstrous. They landed on the shores of a strange, sun-drenched land, where the air itself seemed thick with forgetfulness, a place where reality began to fray at the edges, where the simple act of eating a certain fruit could erase every memory of home, wife, and duty. The journey into the impossible was about to begin, starting with the insidious, gentle horror of the Lotus Eaters. The subtle poison of the Lotus Eaters, that insidious desire for sweet oblivion, was quickly overcome by the sheer willpower of Odysseus, who dragged his men, screaming and weeping for the gentle narcotic dream they were forced to abandon, and chained them back to the rowing benches. It was a victory against the soul, not the sword, and it cost him the immediate faith of his exhausted crew. But they were sailing, driven hard into the unknown sea. Odysseus knew the gods were utilizing the very landscape of the world against him, turning every harbor into a potential grave or a psychological trap. He pushed his remaining ships onward, desperate for a safe, uncursed anchorage, unaware that he was steering directly toward a colossal primeval danger, the land of the Cyclopes, a place untouched by civilization, law, or mercy. They arrived on an island lush with wild goats and surrounded by massive, empty stone caves. This felt promising, a place of plenty. Odysseus, always the curious strategist, selected his 12 most trusted, battle-hardened men and went ashore, carrying not only their weapons, but also a magnificent, potent gift, a skin filled with uncut, deep red wine, a treasure gifted by Marin, the priest of Apollo. He believed, foolishly, that the universal law of hospitality, Xenia, enforced by Zeus himself, would hold sway even in this desolate, savage place. They found a gigantic, raw cave, clearly the home of a shepherd of unimaginable size, filled with massive wheels of cheese, huge pails of milk, and pens overflowing with lambs and kids. The men, starving and practical, urged him to grab the supplies and flee, to perform a quick raid and get back to the open sea before the owner returned. But Odysseus, driven by that fatal mixture of pride and curiosity that had defined his career, insisted they wait to meet the host, to demand the customary gifts. This singular act of arrogance would cost him dearly. Suddenly, the earth shook. A shadow fell over the entrance, and into the cave lumbered Polyphemus, a giant of terrifying bulk, a Cyclops whose single, enormous eye burned fiercely in his forehead. He drove his immense flock inside, and with a grunt that spoke volumes of his contempt for effort, he rolled a slab of stone across the entrance. A boulder so massive it was instantly clear that no mortal force could ever move it. They were sealed inside, prisoners in a dark, stinking, impossible prison. Odysseus stood forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, and attempted diplomacy, invoking the authority of Zeus, the sanctity of their journey, and the shared laws of men. Polyphemus simply threw back his head and let out a bellowing laugh that rattled the very bones of the trapped Achaeans, his voice like grinding stone. "Foolish stranger," the Cyclops sneered, his tone dripping with savage contempt. "We Cyclopes care nothing for your Zeus, your laws, or your petty gods. We are mightier than they are, and we answer only to our hunger." The sickening, echoing sound of bone crunching filled the cavern. They had watched their comrades become dinner, realizing in one terrifying instant that their bronze weapons were useless and their cunning was moot against this primal, unthinking force of nature. They were livestock waiting their turn. Odysseus knew he could not kill the Cyclops in his sleep, for if the giant died, they would be sealed in the cave forever, dying of starvation next to his monstrous corpse. Escape required blinding, not killing, and blinding required cunning greater than any Trojan maneuver. When Polyphemus woke the next morning, he repeated the horrific ritual, eating 2 more men for breakfast before rolling the boulder aside to let his massive flocks out to graze, sealing the survivors back inside like lambs in a slaughterhouse. That day, Odysseus and his remaining men sharpened a colossal olive wood stake into a deadly, fiery point, hiding it in the shadows. That evening, after the Cyclops had gorged himself on 2 more of the Achaeans, Odysseus stepped forward with the skin of potent wine. He offered it to the giant, pleading with him to wash down the unspeakable meal. Polyphemus, smelling the intoxicating liquid, drank deeply and instantly fell victim to the powerful, uncut alcohol. The giant, drunk and slurring, demanded Odysseus's name, promising him a gift of hospitality in return for the wine, the cruelest gift of all. "I shall eat you last after all your companions." Odysseus, seizing the moment of ultimate trickery, replied with practiced calm, "My name is Nobody. Nomen is my name." The giant, roaring with drunken laughter at the silliness of the name, collapsed into a deep, earth-shaking sleep. The moment was now. Odysseus and his 6 remaining men lifted the massive, fire-hardened stake and, with a coordinated surge of desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength, plunged the searing point directly into the giant's single massive eye. The shriek that followed was not merely sound. It was a volcanic eruption of pure agony. The hot, sizzling flesh, the smell of burnt hair, the terrifying noise. It was overwhelming. Blinded, Polyphemus ripped the stake from his face and thrashed wildly, groping desperately for the tiny, mocking men who had inflicted this unimaginable wound. His screams brought the other Cyclopes running to the cave entrance. "What is wrong, brother? Who is hurting you?" they roared. Polyphemus, consumed by pain and the lingering fog of wine, cried out the devastating answer, "No man is killing me! No man is attacking me!" The surrounding giants, hearing the nonsensical reply, concluded that their brother was either mad or suffering from a sickness sent by the gods, and they dispersed, unwilling to interfere with what they believed was a divine affliction. The cunning trick had worked perfectly, but escape was still impossible. Odysseus, with time running out before the giant fully recovered, devised the final, brilliant stroke of genius. He tied his men underneath the bellies of the giant shaggy sheep, weaving thick ropes of wool to secure them tightly, using the animal's natural camouflage. At dawn, when Polyphemus rolled the stone aside, he stood guard, running his huge, sensitive hands over the backs of his beloved sheep as they departed to graze, ensuring no man rode them. But he could not feel the weight of the men clinging desperately to the underside, escaping right beneath his blind, groping hands. Odysseus, clinging to the wool of the largest ram, was the last to exit. They escaped the cave, drove the sheep down to the ships, and pushed off into the blessed salt sea, rowing furiously away from the island of horror and death. But here, safe at last, the hero committed his single, most catastrophic error. His triumph was incomplete without recognition. 100 yards from shore, Odysseus could not resist the overwhelming urge to mock the ruined giant, to ensure his legend was known. He stood on the deck, his voice straining against the wind, and screamed back across the waves. "If any mortal man asks who blinded you, tell him it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, who dwells in Ithaca." That moment of magnificent, terrible triumph sealed his fate. Polyphemus, hearing the true name and the true location, gathered his remaining terrible strength. He pulled the top off a nearby mountain and hurled the colossal rock, guided by the sound of the mocking voice. The boulder missed the ship, but landed with a devastating crash directly in front of their bow, creating a massive tidal wave that drove the ships back toward the shore. Polyphemus, knowing the name of his tormentor, fell to his knees, stretching his bloody hands out over the ocean, and cried out to his father, the terrifying, vengeful Poseidon, god of the sea, begging for the absolute eternal ruin of Odysseus. He had traded a localized horror for the everlasting personal wrath of an Olympian god. They escaped. But the price was not paid in blood, it was paid in eternal damnation. Odysseus, unable to control his own monstrous pride even after survival, roared his true name across the crashing waves to the blind giant floundering on the shore. "If any man asks who inflicted this shameful injury, tell him it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, Laertes' son, whose home is Ithaca." That moment, that single, arrogant shout, was the sound of the gates of hell swinging wide open for the king of Ithaca. He had taken a terrible, localized tragedy, the deaths of 6 men, and traded it for a 20-year war against the cosmos. The ship sliced through the Aegean, but the water felt heavy, thick with the unholy promise of revenge. Every rogue wave, every sudden inexplicable shift in the current, was the breath of the earthshaker, Poseidon, breathing down their necks. They were hunted prey, and the entire Mediterranean was their cage. Despite the lurking danger, hope, that most dangerous of human emotions, flickered briefly. Days bled into weeks of nerve-wracking sailing, but then a miracle appeared on the horizon. The floating island of Aeolia, ruled by Aeolus, the benevolent master of the four great winds. This was a god, perhaps the only one, who saw Odysseus not as a curse, but as a legendary hero deserving of assistance. Aeolus welcomed them with lavish feasts that lasted a full month, pouring out stories of Troy and the triumph over mighty Hector. When the time came to leave, the gift he bestowed was impossible, magnificent, and ultimately the instrument of their unavoidable doom. He presented Odysseus with a massive leather oxhide bag, tightly bound with a silver cord. Inside that bag, Aeolus had imprisoned every gale, every storm, every contrary puff of air that could push them off course, trapping the chaotic breath of the world. He left only the gentle west wind, Zephyr, free to blow them directly home. Ithaca was so close they could almost smell the smoke of their own hearths. For 9 straight days and nights, Odysseus, utterly paranoid, never slept, his hand gripping the tiller, his eyes fixed on the horizon, watching that silver cord like a hawk. He could see the coastline of his homeland now, the familiar slopes of Mount Neriton rising above the waves. They were agonizingly close. But his men, oh, the perpetual poisonous foolishness of mortal men. They had endured war. They had endured the Cyclops. They had survived divine wrath. But they could not endure the sight of the mysterious bulging bag. Whispers turned to shouts, fueled by exhaustion and suspicion. Surely Odysseus was hoarding treasure, gold and silver given by Aeolus, meant only for the king, hidden from the loyal men who had bled beside him. In their minds, this was not a vessel of divine power, but a chest of cold, hard Ithacan currency that belonged to them. As the exhausted Odysseus finally succumbed to sleep, overcome by 9 days of vigilance, the jealous fools struck. They slashed the silver cord. The resulting explosion was not just a blast of air, it was the immediate violent shattering of all remaining hope. Every imprisoned tempest roared out at once, a concentrated cataclysmic force of atmospheric chaos. The storm instantly snatched the ships, ripping the sails to shreds, turning the sleek war vessels into splintered driftwood caught in a cosmic washing machine driven by their own greed. They were blown backward faster than they had sailed forward, straight back to the floating island of Aeolus. Odysseus, utterly broken, woke to find himself back exactly where he started, but now with the added burden of knowing he failed within sight of home. He dragged himself before the Wind King, begging for mercy, pleading for a second, impossible chance. But Aeolus, his face stern and filled with terrible knowledge, simply shook his head and recoiled from the contamination. "Away from this island, you vilest of men!" Aeolus boomed, his voice like rolling thunder across the sea. "It is clear now, you are cursed by the immortal gods themselves. No friend of the blessed immortals would ever suffer such a calamity or endure such treacherous men." He had sailed toward safety and was violently rejected by the only mortal allowed to touch the elements. They were officially untouchable, shunned, forced to row, exhausted and directionless, into the desolate, open unknown. The terror had begun again, but now it was compounded by the crushing realization that the gods themselves had chosen their path of suffering. They rode for 7 agonizing, foodless days until they reached the rugged, terrifying harbor of Telepolis, the city of the Laestrygonians. The geography itself was a trap. High, sheer cliffs surrounded a narrow bay, creating a perfect funnel of death. Odysseus, perhaps learning caution too late, anchored his own ship outside the narrow mouth of the harbor, but allowed his 12 remaining vessels to sail deep inside the sheltered cove. It looked like the perfect resting spot. Then the realization dawned, a chill that froze the blood. This was not a place of men, but a domain of colossal, flesh-eating horrors. The Laestrygonians were giants, their size rivaling the mighty rocks of the cliffs, and their appetites were purely, savagely carnivorous. The alarm was sounded, but it was already too late. These giants were not dumb, shambling beasts. They were organized, tactical predators. They scaled the towering cliffs above the harbor and began raining down boulders the size of elephants onto the trapped ships below. Odysseus watched, paralyzed by the sheer, devastating scale of the massacre unfolding in the cove. He had only one option left. He drew his sword and, in a desperate, criminal act of preservation, he cut the mooring ropes of his own vessel. He ordered his remaining men to row with every ounce of strength they possessed, straight out of that horrific, rock-strewn bay, leaving 11 shattered ships and hundreds of comrades behind to feed the giants. He had started with 12 ships and 600 men ready for war. Now, only Odysseus's single solitary ship remained, carrying the last battered remnants of his crew, sailing toward whatever new, unimaginable hell waited next. The curse had truly begun its final, relentless purge, leaving him alone against the tide. The sea had swallowed the screaming, the broken ships, and the very memory of victory. But the greatest terror following the wrath of Poseidon was the terror of relief. The surviving Achaean fleet, a heartbreaking fraction of the glorious armada that sailed for Troy, finally found a fragile, temporary calm. Odysseus, his eyes ringed by 2 decades of blood and sleepless strategy, knew the lull was a lie, a viper coiled in the shadow of false hope. They limped onto the shores of Ismarus, the land of the Cicenones. This was not the domain of mythical beasts, not yet, but a civilized people, distant allies of Troy, and crucially, a place of abundant wine and livestock. After the horrors of the storm and the starvation of war, the surviving Achaean crew were not heroes. They were hungry, desperate animals. Odysseus, the man who had preached discipline for 10 years, suddenly faced a mutiny born not of malice, but of greed. He commanded them, "Strike fast, take the necessary provisions, and flee immediately before the alarm could be spread across the mainland." But the taste of easy victory, the warm glow of liberated Ciconian wine, was too intoxicating. His men, 72 souls who had survived the walls of Ilium and the murderous sea, ignored their king's frantic warnings. They sprawled across the beach, slaughtering oxen, feasting like gluttons, daring the fates to intervene while they indulged in a spree of lethal indiscipline. The Cicones, however, were not the soft, easily vanquished farmers the crew presumed. They were warriors, and they had neighbors. While Odysseus raged futilely on the shore, the alarm traveled like wildfire through the night, summoning the formidable inland tribes, men trained to fight on horseback, men fresh and fueled by righteous fury. The dawn broke, not with the promise of rest, but with the terrifying thunder of hooves. It was a massacre, swift and brutal. The Achaean survivors, heavy with wine and sleep, were caught in a deadly, overwhelming ambush. This was not divine punishment by sea. This was the direct, agonizing consequence of mortal failure, a perfect example of the curse working through their own fatal flaws. Odysseus fought like the madman he truly was, rallying the few sober men, using every dirty trick he learned in the trenches, but the Ciconian charge was unstoppable. They had escaped Ismarus, but they had paid a terrifying toll, confirming to Odysseus that the god's wrath was not a single event, but a relentless siege on his very existence. He mourned his men, offering the traditional 3 agonizing calls to the lost souls before setting the sails, desperate to put distance between his fleet and the mainland's vengeance. But the gods were not done testing the boundaries of his suffering. As they sailed out, Zeus himself, the alleged king of the Olympian court, unleashed a catastrophic gale. For 9 relentless days, the winds tore at their sails, ripping them violently off course, driving them past the known limits of the world into a realm of terrifying, psychedelic uncertainty. When the storm finally subsided, dropping them onto an unknown, lethargic shore, Odysseus was ready for fire, for battle, or for certain death. What he found was far more insidious, a threat that attacked the mind, not the body. This was the land of the Lotus Eaters. He sent 3 of his most trusted men inland to reconnoiter. They did not return. Odysseus, his heart pounding a rhythm of dread learned long ago, tracked them down, finding them among the local populace, who were not armed with swords, but with a strange, sweet, dangerous fruit, the legendary lotus. The men were not fighting, they were blissfully tranquil, their faces slack with a disturbing, profound peace. They had eaten the lotus, and instantly the epic quest, the desire for Ithaca, the memory of Penelope, the very concept of home had been obliterated from their minds. They wept when Odysseus found them, but not tears of joy. They wept because he was trying to drag them away from their perfect, drug-induced oblivion. The ultimate danger of this land was not loss of life, but loss of purpose. Odysseus, driven by an animalistic urgency to preserve the mission, had to physically subdue his own men. He dragged the 3 unwilling souls back to the ships, their cries of protest ringing out, and had them chained beneath the benches. He commanded every remaining man to immediately flee that accursed shore, forbidding anyone else from even tasting the deadly fruit of forgetting. He had survived the wrath of Poseidon, the ambush of the Cicones, and now the temptation of eternal, devastating peace. The ships cut through the water, leaving the land of sweet forgetfulness behind, carrying men who had seen the terrifying allure of giving up. But ahead lay the true descent into mythological madness, the land where giants ruled and human life was measured only in teeth and bone. The shadow of the Cyclops was already falling over the horizon. The sea breeze tasted of salt and the unknown, carrying the scent of wild thyme and something far more ancient, something monstrous. They landed on the Goat Island, a paradise waiting to be plundered, its shores littered not with hostile men, but with fat, unsuspecting beasts. The men, starved and terrified by the storms Poseidon had hurled at them, begged Odysseus to take the cheese and the livestock to flee before dawn broke. But the king of Ithaca was never one for simple survival. He was a man consumed by the need for knowledge, a fatal curiosity that drove him not towards safety, but straight into the jaws of catastrophe. He took 12 of his finest fighters and a skin of potent uncut wine, a gift from Maron, priest of Apollo, and marched inland toward the enormous cave they spotted carved into the hillside. This was not a quick raid. This was an investigation, a social call to a giant they knew nothing about, armed only with hubris and the most dangerous thirst for fame. Inside, the cavern was vast, echoing, a butcher shop disguised as a dairy. Great wicker pens held lambs and kids, and shelves bowed under the weight of enormous wheels of cheese, dripping with whey and the promise of a feast. They settled down, lighting a fire, waiting for the cave's owner, ignoring every instinct that screamed at them to run before the darkness fully enveloped the entrance. This was the moment curiosity ceased to be a virtue and became a deadly trap. The mountain itself seemed to groan, and then came the sound. A rhythmic, earth-shaking thunder that announced the arrival of the island's savage sovereign. Polyphemus was not a man. He was a walking tower of muscle and primal hunger, carrying an immense bundle of dry wood and driving his enormous flock before him. He rolled the titanic stone, a slab so massive that 22 wheeled wagons could not move it, and sealed the entrance, trapping Odysseus and his terrified crew like mice beneath a bell jar. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed giant and raw savagery. Polyphemus did not bother with pleasantries. His single, massive eye scanned the interlopers with cold, predatory calculation. "Who are you, and where do you come from?" The voice was a gravel slide, a sound that promised death. Odysseus attempted diplomacy, invoking Zeus, the protector of guests, the sacred laws of Xenia. A laughable appeal to a beast who bowed to no god and respected only his own belly. The giant merely laughed, a sound that cracked the very rock ceiling. This was not war. This was butchery. The realization slammed into Odysseus. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for their lives to be nothing more than the next meal. The giant, satiated, stretched out and slept, snoring like a collapsed cliff face. The night was a crucible of terror. Odysseus, frozen in the shadows, watched the giant sleep, his mind racing. To kill him now would guarantee their demise, for they could never move the monstrous boulder blocking the exit. Survival required cunning, not brute force. As dawn broke and the Cyclops let his flock out, resealing the cave with terrifying ease, Odysseus found his tool, a huge olive wood club, green and heavy, which he and 4 of his strongest men sharpened to a needle point and tempered over the dying embers of the fire. The waiting was the hardest part, the silent knowledge that 4 more men would die before the plan could even begin. That evening, Polyphemus returned, consumed 2 more men in a flash of bone-shattering violence, and settled back, bloated and ready for rest. This was the moment. Odysseus stepped forward, holding the potent wine. "Take this, mighty Cyclops," he challenged, "so you may better appreciate the feast you have prepared." Odysseus delivered the line that would echo through history. the ultimate deception. My name is Nobody. That is what my mother and father and all my friends call me. It was now or never. With a terrifying battle cry that was instantly muffled to keep the giant sleeping, Odysseus and his 4 chosen men heaved the enormous wooden stake, its tip glowing red-hot from the fire, and drove it straight into the sleeping giant's single hateful eye. His roars brought the other Cyclopes from the surrounding hills. They gathered outside the cave entrance, their voices booming. "Polyphemus, who is hurting you? Who is killing you by treachery?" And the blinded giant screamed back into the darkness, his words thick with whine and pain, the ultimate testament to Odysseus's cunning. "Nobody, nobody is killing me. Nobody is hurting me." Convinced their brother was suffering from some divine madness or sickness, the other giants retreated, muttering about the futility of human existence, leaving Polyphemus alone in his agonizing blind rage. The initial plan had succeeded, but escape was still impossible. The giant was blind, but he was not stupid. As dawn approached, he rolled the stone away slightly to let his flock graze, sitting himself squarely in the entrance, running his massive, searching hands over the back of every sheep to ensure no man was riding out. Odysseus, master of the impossible, formulated his final, desperate gambit. They took the thickest rams, 3 together, and bound them using the tough vine ropes he had saved. Beneath the central, largest ram, clinging tightly to the woolly underbelly, crawled the surviving men. Odysseus saved the greatest ram for himself, the leader of the flock, the brute that Polyphemus always spoke to. It was the highest risk, but the only way. One by one, the rams shuffled out. The Cyclops caressed the back of each beast, sighing in relief, completely unaware that his own flock was carrying his tormentors to freedom, inches from his grasping, murderous hands. As the great ram carrying Odysseus passed, Polyphemus paused, stroking its head. "My poor ram," he lamented, his voice raw with sorrow. "Why are you the last? Is it grief for your master's eye?" It was a moment of excruciating suspense, the breath held hostage in the throat. Then the ram walked free. They scrambled onto the deck, threw the sheep into the hold, and pulled desperately on the oars, racing toward the open sea, ecstatic, yet broken by loss. But this epic escape was not enough for the hero of Troy. Odysseus, the man who could never leave well enough alone, committed the second, even greater act of hubris. He shouted back across the water, mocking the giant, revealing his true name. "If any mortal asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, sacker of cities, who dwells in Ithaca." This single, arrogant declaration sealed their doom. Polyphemus, roaring curses, prayed instantly to his father, the Earthshaker, the great god Poseidon. Grant that Odysseus never reach his home, or, if he must, let him come late, broken, having lost all his companions, arriving on a ship not his own, finding sorrow in his house. The prayer, dark and potent, was instantly ratified in the halls of Olympus. The curse of the Cyclops was now the official, divine policy of the sea god, transforming the rest of their journey from a difficult passage into a 20-year war against a vengeful ocean. Odysseus had won the battle, but in his moment of triumph, he had ensured that his homecoming would be the most agonizing epic ever told. The salt spray that kissed their faces as they left the smoking ruins of Troy was not the sweet breath of victory, but the chilling sigh of the fates, cutting the thread of their easy journey home. They had pillaged a city and faced down the greatest warriors of the age, yet they were not prepared for the true enemy, themselves. Their ships, heavy with stolen gold, sailed away from Hellespont, their crews swollen with the arrogance of 10 years of survival. They believed they were untouchable, heroes above the reach of mere mortals, which was precisely why the gods decided to remind them how very fragile mortal life truly was. The first stop, Ismarus, the land of the Cicons, was meant to be a simple restocking operation, a quick raid to grab provisions and move on. It became the blood-soaked prelude to 20 years of misery, the first fatal error in the divine calculus of suffering. Odysseus warned them, "Take what you need, but do not linger. The sea is unforgiving." But the men, drunk on victory and wine, treated the Ciconi's coastal city like a playground. They looted the temples, enslaved the women, and settled in for a massive feast right on the shore, their shields discarded, their vigilance dissolved in cheap wine and hubris. This was not the disciplined force that had built the wooden horse. This was a mob waiting for the butcher. The Cicones, fierce and effective fighters, retreated only long enough to rally their kinsmen from the inland mountains, riders who came thundering down at dawn like a tidal wave of vengeance, mounted on swift war horses. They escaped under the cover of a desperate charge, rowing away frantically while the cries of their dead echoed across the water. The tally was 72 irreplaceable lives lost before they even saw the first true monster. This was the terrifying cost of impiety, and the journey had barely begun. But the Cicones were only the messengers. The true architect of their pain, Zeus himself, watched the massacre and decided the lesson had not been learned quickly enough. He unleashed the full, unbridled fury of the Aegean upon their fleet. A northerly gale, a monstrous wind known as Boreas, struck the fleet with the force of a divine hammer, ripping sails to shreds, shattering masts, and tossing the ships like children's toys against the churning gray waves. For 2 days and 2 nights, they were utterly helpless, fighting not an enemy with a spear, but the elemental rage of the cosmos. The men were pummeled by the sheer power of the deep, their bodies bruised, their spirits broken. They looked at their captain with serene, terrifying apathy, begging him to stay and share the joy of oblivion. They were victims of the perfect psychological trap. They had been defeated by happiness itself.